If you've got John chapter 8, the King James Version reads as thus. And early in the morning he came again into the temple, and all the people came unto him and sat down and taught them. And the scribes and Pharisees brought unto him a woman taken in adultery. And when they had set her in the midst, they say unto him, Master, this woman was taken in adultery in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what sayest thou? This they said, tempting him, that they might have to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground as though he heard them not. So when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself and said unto them, He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground, and they which heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning at the eldest, even unto the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. Do me a favor, run back up to verse number 6. I want to shine the sermonic spotlight here. This they said, tempting him, that they might have to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and with his finger, stop right there. For our time of sharing today, allow me to hang this homiletical headline above this text. Headline reading, When Jesus Gives You the Finger. When Jesus gives you the finger. As we tune into the times of our text, we encounter Christ evading the snare laid for him by a group of scribes and Pharisees and bringing before him this woman taken in the very act of adultery. And while on the surface, the actions of these scribes and Pharisees appear pure, closer examination reveals that they were really being petty, as they seemingly placed Jesus in a peculiar and precarious predicament. For on the one hand, if Jesus were to condemn her, he would not be seen as a savior, for the law could do as much. They would then censure him as being inconsistent with himself, as well as the character of the Messiah. But if he let her go, he would despise and disallow the law, be seen as an enemy of Moses, and would confirm that he came to overthrow the law and the prophets. But Jesus, fully aware that these men didn't care about this woman's sin, soul, or salvation. As a matter of fact, Jesus literally saw the setup. Because just 24 hours prior, they were describing him as deceiver. But here in verse number 4, they're declaring him as master. Clearly, these men had a motive and a mission to misuse this woman to malign Jesus. But Jesus, insightful of the issue insulated within this illicit trial, Jesus, he takes this issue. He inverts the issue. Jesus flips the script on the issue. And by the time Jesus is done dealing with the issue, those who give the finger end up getting the finger from Jesus. Can I talk with you? The look on some of your faces is suggesting that you're saying in your mind, but Stephen, wait a minute. I thought that this text was about adultery. I thought that this text was about sexual sin. Well, Salem, yes. We find that here within this text, but because the church has an unhealthy addiction with sexual sins, we tend to miss the mark in ministering to the consortium of maladies that the biblical text labels as sin. Well, Stephen, what's so prominent? What's so pressing? What's so influential? What's so impressive? What's so potent? What's so powerful about finger pointing that it would gain prominence and preeminence in your preaching proclamation today? Salem, I've come to discover that this sin called finger pointing, it has some dangerous and detrimental and damaging derivatives that result when we decide that we're going to give somebody the finger. And I'd be remiss if I didn't share these damaging results with you in an effort to keep your finger to yourself. I don't know if y'all ready for this today. But as we penetrate the periphery of this particular pericope, our initial encounter with the ensuing issue initiates within the 2nd through the 4th verse. And the Bible says, and early in the morning, he came again into the temple, and all the people came unto him, and he sat down and taught them. And the scribes and Pharisees brought unto him a woman taken in adultery. And when they had set her in the midst, they say unto him, Master, this woman was taken in adultery in the very act. As we tune into the times of our text, we discover that Jesus is in the temple. He's now teaching and preaching. And if I've got any Bible readers in the house, you'll testify that that week prior, Jesus had been running a revival. I wish I had some Sunday school attendees in the church this morning. He's now in the midst of his message to those who've come to drink from the living water. When in the midst of the worship experience, while teaching and preaching are going forth, these scribes and Pharisees, these religious leaders, these church people, these people who had titles and positions in the church, these people who had special parking in the church, these people that some of them got paid by the church, these people who grown up in church, who've been in church long enough to know the protocol and the procedures for church. I'm talking about people that went to vacation Bible school, people that go to Sunday school, people that back in the day went to BTU, people that were in church all day on Sunday, there on Wednesday for Bible study, Thursday night for choir rehearsal, Saturday for all the busy B club, people in the church that knew the church, knew the intricacies of the church, people that should have had some church decorum, people who should have had some worship etiquette, people who should have known how to act when they got in church. Here they come in the midst of the worship experience. While Jesus is teaching and preaching, they barge in, interrupting and influencing the worship experience. And Stephen, how are you so clear? How are you so sure that it was a worship experience? Well, there are 4 things here in the text that give me inclination as to what was going on within the times of our text. Number 1, the time. It was early in the morning. Number 2, the place. They were in the temple. Number 3, the population. There was a large crowd gathered there. Number 4, and most importantly, his position. Jesus was sitting in the posture, according to Jewish tradition, of one who has authority to teach. Jesus was teaching. Jesus was preaching. And if I could wander down the lanes of my memory, if I could go into the theater of my imagination, I can picture the scene, Salem. Jesus had probably just got done singing, "Lead Me, Guide Me." In my mind's eye, he was somewhere in his introduction, about to make his exit to his first point, ready to penetrate the periphery of his particular pericope. When down the center aisle comes these scribes and Pharisees, these legalistic religious leaders, dragging this woman to interrupt and influence the worship experience. Salem, it ain't like they could not have waited until after church. I mean, they didn't hold church as long as we hold church. They could have waited until after the benediction. I mean, they could have sent a note by an usher, "Jesus, we need to holler at you after worship. I mean, after you get done shaking hands and kissing babies and praying for people, we got an issue that we need your attention for. Jesus, after church, can we meet with you in the office?" I mean, it's not like they could not have called Jesus's Denise and set up an appointment to come into the office on Monday morning to have a conversation with Jesus about the crimes and the sins of this woman caught in adultery. But in the midst of worship, while teaching and preaching were going forth, while praise was going forth in the temple, they dragged this woman down the aisle to the front of the church, in front of the other church people, to address her sins and her issues. Salem, I see you. I hear you. Your verbal as well as your nonverbal communication suggests that you agree with me that these church people were out of order. These people who should have known how to act should have acted better in this situation, that they were guilty of interrupting and influencing the worship experience. But just as you're willing to label them as guilty, I wonder how many of us in this place are likewise willing to admit our own guilt. Can I talk with you? Doing praise and worship, your hands are lifted. You're blessing God with the fruit of your lips. While the choir is singing, you're getting your praise on. While the announcements are being played, you're taking down copious notes so that you can engage in the activities of the ministry of Salem Baptist Church of Chicago. But I've noticed something. During the fellowship period, when most of us are up greeting and shaking hands and hugging and fanning flies and telling lies and catching up with folk we ain't talked to since last week, during the family reunion period, I've noticed that some of y'all are still sitting there. You ain't moved, you ain't winked, you ain't shook no hand, you ain't greeted your neighbor, you ain't said hi, bye, nothing. Walter, I've come to discover that many of those that are sitting there, they're sitting there because they're running their reconnaissance. Oh, they're surveying the scenery of the sanctuary. They're trying to see who's sitting with who. Who rolled up in here with who. Who's sitting on this side that normally sits together, but now one is sitting on that side. Who ain't got their wedding ring on today? What family that last week looked like Heathcliff and Claire Huxtable is looking like the Munsters this week? They're sitting there running their reconnaissance. They're checking Facebook pages. I see this picture on his page and I see this picture on her page and the backgrounds look the same, but I don't see. And by the time the word goes forth, by the time the preaching period has been extended, here comes your finger. While the word is going forth, while the message is being ministered, as you're calling people out, as you're announcing your assumptions, as you're singling out people's sins, as you're adding your 2 cents to the gossip and giving life to lies, you're interrupting and influencing the worship experience. You're diverting attention from the teachings to other people's transgressions. And I stopped by to encourage you that you need to put your finger away. Because while you're pointing your finger at somebody else's issue in the midst of the worship experience, while the teaching and the preaching are going forth, you're clogging up people's spiritual filters. Your finger pointing, it dilutes and pollutes the atmosphere of worship. People come into this place to hear a word, to get something from God, to have an encounter with the Kyrios Christos, to meet Jesus. But they make the mistake of sitting next to you. You talking, you gossiping, you passing notes, you whispering, you pointing your finger, you talking about stuff that you really don't know about. You're polluting, diluting the atmosphere of worship. People can't hear a word because of your word. And we wonder why people come into God's house and can't get saved, can't get healed, can't get helped, can't get delivered, can't get set free because they sat next to you. I wonder how many people have come into God's house to meet God but missed him because they sat in your section. And they couldn't hear a word from the Lord because they had to hear all the mess and malfeasance menstruating from your mouth. How many people have opted not to join the church, have opted not to become a member of the kingdom, all because of the murders that were committed by your mouth in worship? It's in the church where we kill the wounded. This should be a place of restoration, not a place of damnation. This should be a place where people can come to get help and to get healed, to be made whole. But when we find out some stuff, here we go. Not only do we see the public problem, the finger pointing, as it interrupts and influences the worship experience, but second, there's the private pitfall that comes from finger pointing. See, Salem, what we often fail to realize while we're giving someone the finger is that our finger pointing can inadvertently indicate our own indulgence. What I've discovered in life is that you really can't talk about something that you don't know about. And to know about it, you've got to have some experience in or with it. I mean, to really talk about it. To say that you know that you know that you know that you know. You got to have some experience in or with that thing. You can't talk about being up unless at some point in your life you've been down. Can't talk about being happy unless some stuff has happened in your life that's caused you to experience some sadness. You can't talk about being free unless you've experienced some bondage or some constriction in your life. To really be able to talk about it, you've got to know about it. And to know about it, you've got to have some experience with it. So I found myself confounded and confused when I read the text. Because in verse number 4, the text says, they say unto him, Master, this woman was taken in adultery, in the very act. Y'all missed it. Let me back that thing up and say it for you one more again. They say unto him, Master, this woman was taken in adultery, in the very act. Y'all still not getting it. Maybe I need to Thurstonize the text for you. Jesus, we found this woman tricking off. We caught her, and now we're bringing her before you. Y'all don't even like the Thurstonized version of the text. Let me give you some more Bible. Deuteronomy 19, verse number 15. Let me help you to understand why I'm confounded and confused by the conduct here of these scribes and Pharisees. Because the text says the law, according to Moses, states in Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse number 15, one witness shall not rise up against a man for an iniquity or for any sin, in any sin that he sinneth. At the mouth of two witnesses or at the mouth of three witnesses shall the matter be established. Here it is. According to the law of Moses, it states that for an accusation to be made legal, there must be at least two witnesses. No, that's not what it said. It said that there has to be at least two eyewitnesses. Eyewitnesses that saw it with their own eyes. So if there were at least two eyewitnesses who caught this woman in the very act, inquiring minds want to know, where's the man in this situation? All I'm trying to get you to see is that when you point your finger at somebody else's stuff, you've got three fingers pointed right back at you. My research into the social context of the climate of this text revealed unto me that fornication and adultery were running rampant throughout this society, Pastor Meeks, even and especially among the ranks of scribes and Pharisees. Could it be that the man that this woman was caught with was one of them? But because it was a man's world, in a patriarchal society where women didn't mean nothing, she didn't have a voice to say, my accuser is right here. Or maybe she would be like many of us and turn a blind eye to a woman's voice when she cries out that I didn't do this on purpose. I was raped. I was molested. I was assaulted. Me too. So while you're busy shining the spotlight on somebody else, all you're really doing is shifting speculation back upon yourself, which then makes me inquire and want to know how some of y'all know so much. I mean, can we talk? Can we be real today? Some of y'all got all the tea. Where you getting your intel from? Where you getting your information from? How you know so much? You know a whole lot that goes on behind closed and locked doors. But you know details, you know dates, you got information, you got timelines, you got receipts, screenshots. How you know? How you know they finances messed up? How you know what they get high off of? Y'all got the same supplier? Y'all in line together? I mean, how do we know so much? How do we know? How do you know that their marriage is on shaky ground? Are you the heifer that's breaking up a happy home? How do you know? Where you get this from? How you know he in the closet? Is it because you jump in the closet every now and then to play in the closet too? How do you know? Where do you get your information from? Why do you feel so confident sharing this information as if it's the gospel truth? If we would just spend 6 months minding our own business and the other 6 months staying out of somebody else's business, maybe we could get our life together. Because the sins that we're often most critical of in others are the same sins that we're most guilty of in our own lives. Let me give you some more Bible. Matthew chapter 7, verse number 5. The text says, "Thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam of thy own eye, and then shalt thou see clearly to cast out the mote out of thy brother's eye." Can I Thurstonize the text? Get the 2x4 out of your eye before you try to blow the sawdust out of my eye. Sweep around your own front door before you come to mine and get checked. So many Christians are guilty of using the biblical text to judge others and to bring down their enemies, yet we never apply that same text to our own lives. Who are you? Who made you Jesus Jr.? So I want us to understand that whenever we find fault in others, we ought to first reflect upon ourselves and be more severe against sin in our own lives than in others. Secondly, when we find one of our brothers or our sisters who's at fault, when we find a brother or sister that's fallen down, that's missed the mark, we ought to be more favorable. Not to the sin, but to the sinner, restoring them with a spirit of weakness, considering our own corrupt nature. Fact of the matter is, somebody else's stuff got made public, but yours didn't. That's the only difference. That's the only reason some of us ain't locked up today. If people could go in your closet, if people could go in your cell phone right now, people could go in your picture vault. People could read through your text thread. These pretentious presentations of holiness sat down. The Bible doesn't say that y'all have sinned. It says that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God And we need to stop making big sins and little sins. All sin is equal in the eyesight of God. It's a private pitfall. While you point your finger at somebody else, you're really just telling on your own self. I'm over my time. Let me go. Not only does our finger pointing cause public problem, as it interrupts and influences the worship experience. Not only does our finger pointing expose our private pitfall, as it can serve as indication of our own indulgence. But third and finally, I've got to go to my sheet when I tell you that there's the possibility of payback. When we position ourselves as self-anointed, puritanical, moral guardians, serving as judge and jury over other people's lives, we become returning boomerangs. When we throw correctly a boomerang, it will come right back to us. And when we throw our finger around the right way, I've come to tell you today that the stuff that we throw out with our finger will turn right back around in the air, circulate, and arrive back at its starting point. And you wonder why people are always talking about you. You wonder why people are criticizing you. You wonder why people are lodging complaints against you. Do you ever wonder why it's so difficult to maintain healthy and whole and sustainable relationships with people? Do you ever wonder why you always talking about haters? Do you wonder why your inner circle has a revolving door attached to it? Do you ever wonder why people don't trust you? Could it be that we're reaping the harvest we've sown with our fingers? Stephen, I really don't care what people have to say about me. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. The possibility of payback, Stephen, it doesn't bother me. Matter of fact, Stephen, I've listened to everything that you've had to say thus far. I get it. It's hypocritical for sinners to want to harm other sinners because of sin. I'm not going to allow their finger pointing at me, Stephen, to bother me, to affect me, their judgment and their accusation of me to impact me. Matter of fact, they'll suffer the same consequences that I have if they point their finger at me, Stephen. I really don't care about the possibility of payback. Well, Salem, that might be true. But what if the one that's giving the finger doesn't have anything to hide? What if there are no skeletons in the closet? What if there's no dirt to dig up on that individual? What happens when it's Jesus that's giving the finger? Here in the text, Jesus gives the finger in verse number 6, but then he turns around and gives the law in verse number 7. The law states in Deuteronomy 17, 5 through 7, that the punishment for the offense committed by this woman would be death by stoning. And those who served as the eyewitnesses had the responsibility and the charge of executing her punishment. However, there's a caveat to the law. The executioner, according to the law of Moses, must be innocent of the same offense, lest by stoning this woman, he would then stand in line to be stoned to death himself. He had a responsibility as the prosecutor to carry out the execution of the penalty and the punishment. And I wonder if the same stipulations were applied to you and me. How infrequently would we find ourselves sitting at the prosecution table? If we had to be guilty, innocent rather, of the same offense that we point our finger at concerning somebody else, how many of us could actually lift our finger? And I see you. You're sitting there looking back at me as if to say, well, Stephen, there's some stuff I could point my finger at. There's some sins that I've never committed. I really wish I had a few more minutes. I wish I had time to unpack this, to help you to understand that sin doesn't begin and end with the act. Sin begins in the mind. And to think it is just like doing it. You're just as guilty. Well, Stephen, there's some stuff I ain't even thought about doing. Yes, you have. Can I take you to psychology class for a quick minute? Psychology 101. For you to be able to determine if something is good or bad, right or wrong, yes or no, I will or I won't, you have to consciously or subconsciously process it through your mind. We've all thought about everything. And the moment we thought about it, the moment we became guilty, we ain't got the right. We ain't got a reason. Nor do we have a responsibility to point our finger at somebody else. In the text, Jesus gives them the finger in verse number 6, turns around and gives them the law in verse number 7. In verse number 8, he gives them a finger again. But then in verse number 9, they leave. I wonder what it is that Jesus wrote in the ground in verse number 8 that convicted their conscience. I wonder what it was that Jesus wrote in the ground that caused them to drop their stones on the spot. I wonder what it was that Jesus wrote that caused them to walk away from the oldest to the youngest. Y'all want to know what Jesus wrote? I've got a theological answer for you. I don't know. Nobody knows. But in the theater of my imagination, maybe Jesus stooped down and with his finger began to write out the 10 Commandments. Maybe Jesus stooped down and with his finger began to write out their names in fulfillment of Jeremiah 17:13. Maybe Jesus stooped down and with his finger began to write out the names of the women that they'd had affairs and adultery and fornication situations with. I wonder if Jesus wrote out their thoughts. I wonder if Jesus wrote out their jump offs. I wonder if Jesus wrote out the names of their mistresses. What is it that Jesus would have to write out about you for you to drop your stones today? It was in that moment that Jesus wrote whatever he wrote in verse number 8, that these men had to face who they really were. None of them could throw a stone because they were guilty of the same offense. They had to face not who they presented themselves to be, but they had to face who they really were. And that's one of the hardest things that you and I will ever have to do, is to be honest with who we are. I promise you, if you call yourself by your sins, oh, it'll convict your conscience. If you start calling yourself a liar because you lie, it'll do something to you. If you start calling yourself a lush because you are, it'll convict your conscience. If you start calling yourself a whore because you are, it'll convict your conscience. If you start calling yourself a gossiper because that's what you do, these men have to face who they are. My challenge to us today, Salem, is to take a look in the mirror. Take off the makeup. Take off the wig. Take off the drawn on eyebrows. Take off the hair pieces. Take off the Beijing you done painted in your hairline and your beard. Take it off. Get naked. Look in the mirror. Call ourselves what we really are. And after you call yourself what you really are, remember that there's some hope. Because the conviction of our sins, it shouldn't drive us from Jesus, but it ought to drive us to Jesus. Because there's no sin that Christ hasn't forgiven. So the next time you get ready to point your finger at somebody else, think about who you are. Think about what you are. Think about what you've done, and consider the fact that God still loves you And at the same level of grace and forgiveness and love that God deals with you, we're called to extend the same level of grace, love, and forgiveness to somebody else. Salem, that's my time. Thank you for your time. I holla.